Hi everyone, my name is Andy Evansen. I'm going to talk about the issue of how to not overwork your paintings. That's kind of an age-old question, knowing when to stop, especially when you're working from reference photographs. The tendency is to put too much into it. One of the things I talk about in my classes, and you will see this in the fast track to watercolor, is the importance of concentrating on big shapes. Number one, early on in the painting, those value studies really help. I'm going to go ahead and show a couple examples of my value studies here so you can see what I'm talking about. One of the ways that value studies help is by taking color out of the equation, and you're just kind of breaking down shapes versus are they light or middle value or dark, okay? And when I'm doing these value studies now, what I try to do the majority of the time is when I'm putting in my dark details, I try to reserve those dark details for the middle ground and foreground and keep the background as the middle values in light, okay? As soon as you add contrast into your paintings, visually those shapes tend to come forward, all right? So that's just something to keep in mind. Again, when you're working off of a reference photograph and from life, actually, your eyes adjust. You start looking at that mountain in the background and seeing all the details. This was a mountain full of trees, okay, and rocks and things. If I had broken that all up into a bunch of little shapes, the whole painting breaks down and becomes very confusing, okay? It's just a background shape. So that's something you can keep in mind to keep yourself from overworking your painting. Here's another example from Central Park in New York, all right? Obviously the buildings in the background help to show that it's a park in a big city, and if anybody's familiar with this spot, they might even recognize it as Central Park. But when I'm putting my dark details in, I reserve them for middle ground, that kind of area of the trees behind the fountain area here, and then foreground, the fountain, the figures, and the bikes. So instantly, visually, all those shapes come forward in the viewer's mind, and everything else kind of stays back in the distance. Yes, when I was looking at the reference photograph, you could see shadows on the buildings, even windows on the skyscrapers, but just like the mountain that I was referring to before, if I start putting in all that detail, it just breaks everything down. That's when you start overworking, when you feel the need to put everything into your paintings, okay? Just because it's there in the scene. I want it to look like a painting. We're trying to convince the viewer of this great amount of depth in the scene on a flat little piece of paper, okay? So we need to use those values effectively, making sure that we're not putting darks way back in the distance.
Before I continue, I want to tell you about an exciting opportunity to study with me in Artefacto School. This is an online workshop where you learn a very important skill for both beginners and advanced students alike. That's the simplification of forms. I'll explain and demonstrate how to use value studies to simplify the shapes in your subject, and that keeps you from overworking a painting with extra and unnecessary details. Also, we'll review some of my students' paintings and do a minimalistic sketch together. There's a link in the upper right corner. If you click on it, that's your free ticket to the workshop. You can also find the link in the description of this video. Thanks.
Here's an example of a fairly complicated reference photograph. Same kind of thing. We're not looking miles into the distance, just a few city blocks in this instance, but there's still a lot of detail on that cathedral, and it's an interesting shape. So the tendency would be to put too many dark shapes on there, but in this instance, that cathedral is the furthest thing back in the distance. All right. So when I'm doing my value study initially, I'm finding that big connected middle value shape. And by kind of sticking to the outsides of the shapes, that also helps me, prevents me from overworking, okay? Initially, all I'm worried about is if it's light and then everything else. And those connections between shapes are going to get rid of a lot of the busy white edges and white gaps between your shapes and your paintings and annoying hard edges, okay? So this first step of my value study really helps. And then the darks on top of that, and here's another example, when I put my darks on, reserving those for the building that's right in front of us, the car, I added a couple figures in there, all right? And then that cathedral is pushed back into the distance. So just trying to keep that in the back of your mind. And it's tricky, again, when you have a beautiful, interesting shape like this, to start putting more and more on it. But if I had, added all those dark windows and shapes on there, again, you don't get that same sense of depth into your painting, and then it can easily become overworked. All right, and then the color painting itself, I'm gonna zoom out a little bit here so you can see the whole thing. Sticking to that value study plan, using the reference photograph for color choices and a little bit of the detail work, all right? But overall, I added just a couple of little tiny windows on there, but I really tried to keep that cathedral in the background, middle value and light, connecting with the trees, and reserve my darkest darks for that middle ground, foreground area. That's a very effective way to keep yourself from overworking your paintings. All right. Another example here of one of my paintings with the reference photograph. Here's the reference photograph here for you. All right, and in this case, all the snow on the trees could have become very, very cumbersome. Okay, if I had attempted to, try and definitely not paint around all those, but even in the end, maybe coming back with gouache just to show all of that, it just becomes visually very confusing. Okay, I wanted to focus on the little figure wearing the orange jacket shoveling. I liked the shapes in the road, and then just enough of the snow-covered trees to kind of show that there was a fresh snowfall. That's all I was worried about. Okay, so when I go to the painting, I put that little figure in here, and I got rid of some of the snow around that area because it's so bright. Kind of midday, and there was a lot of the snow. He was kind of placed in front of the lighter house, and even that darker tree, if I had put all that white on there, that orange doesn't stand out enough. So I got rid of some of that snow, and it really helps and I moved the figure over in front of that darker tree to help pop that figure out. But if you look at the background, once again, what I was talking about, if I zoom in, yes, you're going to see all this detail back there in the background, all the little tree trunks on the bluff way back there, all the little branches and wires and all that stuff. You can get really carried away if you're not paying attention to that whole concept of leave things in the distance, middle value and light, and reserve your darks for up close. And then one last time, also referring to trees here. This is a large painting that I did after my workshop in Mexico. Trees can be, I've seen a lot of paintings break down because of a busy handling of trees and foliage, okay? Now in this case, this is a big half sheet painting, and the trees are a large part of it, so I couldn't just, simplify it too much and ignore it. But I think if you compare it to the reference photograph here, all that busyness, much like I was just talking about on the winter scene too, okay? I loved in this painting, I liked the White House, the reflection of the White House, that ochre stream coming through, and then obviously the horses are the star of the show, okay? So I'm paying more attention to those areas, making sure that they pop out. So it was very, very important that I simplified those tree shapes down a bit, okay? So and it does help to add some of those darks into your tree while that initial middle value wash and light wash is still damp. I went back in and put some dry brushing dark shapes in afterwards, but nowhere near what you saw in the reference photograph, okay? So again, kind of focusing on the important parts and simplifying background. You'll notice again, my darkest darks, where are they? In the details, down here in the foreground. Back here, again, it's not a great amount of distance, but I don't have these darker darks back here in the background, okay? Visually, that helps to create that space. So that's a real important tip to keep yourself from overworking your paintings. Don't keep putting darks in everywhere just because they're in the scene. All right, hope that helped.